Several weeks ago, when I was in London taking that class, one of the parishes we visited was St. James Parish in Piccadilly Circus. It's a very densely packed urban area, lots of high-rise buildings in that area, and St. James kind of sits in the midst of them. But St. James sits back a little bit off of the street, so it has this very large courtyard in the front. And, one of the things that they've done there to sort of get a little more traffic in and around the church is they've opened that courtyard up to vendors. So there are artists and craftspeople and people selling souvenir T-shirts and things like that who have set up shop in the courtyard of the church. So it's kind of funny as we were walking up and kind of came around the corner and saw this place. This gospel was the very first thing that came to mind for me. And evidently, I wasn't alone in that thought, because the student next to me kind of stops and looks at it and makes some sort of comment about maybe Jesus needing to stop by and turn over some T-shirt tables that day. But we were there for several hours that day, and much to our dismay, Jesus never did show up and make a whip of cords and chase them out. So we left there feeling pretty confident that all those little fundraising things that we do here in the church are probably safe. So, of course, Jesus' tirade that day in the temple really wasn't at all about T-shirt sales. Jesus' disruption that day really was more about showing a powerful sign that he had come to change the way that things were in the world. And I know it's kind of difficult sometimes to think about the story that way. We usually think about this story sort of coming at the end of Jesus' life, perhaps even after he had ridden that donkey into Jerusalem, and that really this might have been the event that sort of sealed the deal, if you will, for those who were opposed to Jesus. It seems to us like that confrontation was kind of what gave the authorities the final evidence they needed in order to have Jesus arrested. Now, it is true that in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, this story does come at the end of their Gospels. And it's also probably true that Jesus' outburst there in the temple was probably one of the last straws before his arrest and his trial and crucifixion. But the interesting thing is, you might notice about this particular gospel, is that it comes in the beginning of John's gospel. It's right there in chapter 2. So that is kind of perplexing to many. Causes you to wonder what's going on here. Did this event happen more than once in Jesus' ministry? Or was there something else going on? Well, I think it's likely that something else was going on. I think it's likely that all four of the gospel writers knew the same story, but I think, as is often the case, we find that John has a slightly different take on the story than perhaps what Matthew, Mark, and Luke do. For John, the story seems to have a different meaning. I think John doesn't necessarily see this as sort of a political last straw, if you will, that led to Jesus' arrest. I think instead, for John, Jesus' actions in the temple really point more to the heart of who he believes Jesus to be, who Jesus in fact is. And for that reason, it really had to come at the beginning of John's gospel and not at the end. If you take a closer look at this second chapter in the Gospel of John, you'll actually see that there are two stories there. And the two stories are connected by this short little line about Jesus and his family going to Capernaum. But the first story in this chapter is the story of the miracle at Cana, the wedding in Cana. You remember that story where Jesus turns the water into wine? Well, that story has much greater meaning to John, perhaps, than it does to Matthew, Mark, and Luke as well. John tells us a particular detail in that story that I think sometimes we miss because we're kind of so excited about and fascinated by this whole thing that happens with the wine. But what John tells us is that the stone jars were used for rites of purification. So what Jesus has done, according to John's gospel, is turn the purification water into wine. And that's significant as it relates to our gospel today. Why is it important? Well, the truth of the matter is that by the time of Jesus, the Jews had this amazing, elaborate, and difficult system of purification that they had worked together. Some things in their lives were considered pure, and other things were considered impure. For example, women were impure for 7 days after the birth of a son. Incidentally, they were impure for 14 days after the birth of a daughter. Dead bodies were impure. People with blemishes, such as leprosy, were impure. Certain foods were considered impure. Almost anything sexual was impure. And this list had gotten very, very long. And the requirements of the Jewish people were arduous at best. A few weeks ago I told you about theologian Marcus Borg having died, and what a loss that was. Marcus makes a statement in his book, Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time. He says this purity system, that the effect of the purity system was to create a world with sharp social boundaries between pure and impure, righteous and sinner, whole and not whole, male and female, rich and poor, Jew and Gentile. So, what this means is that changing the water into wine was not so much about how to have a great party as it was about breaking down barriers. It was a different way of seeing the world and God's presence in the world. So it's no accident that the miracle at Cana was the very first sign that Jesus performs in the Gospel of John. And it's also, maybe then, not a surprise that that's immediately followed by this work that he does in the temple. I think that it's no accident that in the temple we're looking at something else that involves the purity system. The animals there were required for sacrifice. And there were economic implications at play here as well, because poor people could not afford to purchase the best animals for sacrifice. The money changers are also an essential part of this whole system as well. See, it was idolatrous if you used a Roman coin with Caesar's head stamped on it for your sacrifice. So you went to the money changer, but these guys weren't just, somebody there to make change for a 20. No, these guys would take impure tokens for pure tokens and make a lot of money in the process. It was sort of first century check cashing business. Now, Jesus was deeply Jewish. I mean, Jesus was a devout Jew. He was shaped by the Torah. He was committed to teaching in the synagogue. But he wasn't the first person to come along in the life of the Jewish people and speak against this kind of abuse that we see in the temple. I mean, for centuries before, prophets of old had commented on this issue as well. Micah and Amos and Jeremiah, to name but a few. All of these had made comments about this purity system and the inequalities that it created. And Jesus came and challenged that system. He challenged that system in almost everything he did. So I think that it cannot be accidental that so many of the gospel stories about Jesus in all four of the gospels speak of his getting dirty in life, if you will. Story after story, person after person. Like all of Israel's greatest prophets, Jesus longed to draw people back to the heart of God, back to that first commandment. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. To coin a term that's actually often used by our own Bishop Wainick, Jesus' actions here are essentially saying, remember who you are, and remember more importantly whose you are. Jesus' life and ministry challenged the rules that named things and people as being either pure or impure. And these categories were being overturned through God's compassion as delivered through Jesus. You know, this call to compassion is seen throughout John's gospel. Compassion for the Samaritan woman at the well. She was considered impure by her bloodline and her behavior. Compassion for the woman accused of adultery and threatened with stoning. I mean, she was surely considered impure, and the written law said so. Compassion for those who have not yet become sheep in God's fold. I mean, we still have plenty of those in our community today. So I think it's not strange then that the temple cleansing comes early in John's gospel. It needs to. You know, John departs from the other gospel writers at the end of his gospel as well. You know, when we come to the last week of Jesus' life, John again departs the other gospel writers. He doesn't have a story like they have. The story that we often call the Last Supper, John has no words about a Last Supper. He has no words about bread or wine. Jesus never says, "Do this in remembrance of me," in John's gospel. Instead, Jesus gets down on his knees and he washes his disciples' dirty feet. And once more, in John's gospel, the tables are overturned, just as they are at the beginning in the temple. The question remains, who is the master and who is the servant? And then Jesus says to his friends, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, not by maintaining boundaries, not by naming some as pure and others as impure, not by protecting the church from getting dirty, but by this love that you have for one another. So, in the end, no, this gospel is not about t-shirt sales in the temple. Instead, it's about the deep, disruptive compassion that God has for each and every one of us. Amen.